Okay, thank you very much, Christina. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. So very excited to be able to present to you today some of the research that has been going on both in my lab over the last 10 or so years and also through a couple of the flagship programs with which I've been involved. So first of all, the World Harbour Project based out of the Sydney Institute of Marine Sciences, which some of you may have been involved with, and also our Living Seawalls program, which is all about scaling up marine greening solutions. And so the problem that I'm going to be dealing with today in my talk is the growing issue of marine urban sprawl. So we're currently experiencing a construction boom in our oceans. So this is everything from coastal defence structures aimed at protecting our coastal assets from rising sea levels and erosion, to man-made islands, human-made islands, to the growth of offshore renewable energy. And of course, there is shipping, which is critically important to global trade. So our team did a bit of a synthesis of the number of these structures that are presently in our waters worldwide and came up with the figure of 32,000 kilometres squared that is currently being modified by these structures. So this is the actual area that they're physically occupying. And if we actually look at the area that is being impacted, it's equivalent to the area occupied by the world's seagrass beds and mangroves forests combined. So it's a significant issue already, and we project that in the next 10 years there's going to be a 70% increase in the number of these structures, fueled by a growth in the blue economy and also growth in coastal protection. So why is this a problem? Well, first of all, I guess there is loss of marine habitat associated with the actual footprint of these structures. So obviously where these structures are constructed, that changes and modifies habitat. If these are constructed along coastlines, they can interfere with natural regression and accretion of things like beaches, and so you can get loss of shoreline profile as a consequence of that. And in some instances, they can also modify wave reflection and refraction and cause changes in erosion. And so we can get short changes in habitat as a consequence of this. They can serve as physical barriers. So this is just a demonstration of this here. So I guess naturally sea turtles would come ashore to sandy beaches to lay their eggs. But where we have coastal armouring, this can severely truncate the profile of beaches, resulting in loss of dune and high shore habitat, causing turtles to have to actually wander for considerable distances to find suitable nesting places, and resulting in a loss of reproductive success. But what I really want to deal with today is, I guess, the role of these structures as novel habitat. So not only are they actually replacing natural habitat, destroying natural habitat, but they're actually replacing it with a new habitat as well. And when we look at this habitat, it's quite different to natural analogues. So if we think about a natural rocky shore or rocky reef, which might be the closest natural equivalent, it tends to have a horizontal orientation and consequently a very large intertidal area. It has a high degree of habitat heterogeneity. So if you've ever walked along one of these natural habitats, you'll notice rock pools, crevices, lots of microhabitats in which life can thrive. By contrast, these built structures tend to have a vertical orientation, they tend to have a very compressed intertidal zone, and by contrast, they tend to have a relatively flat and featureless surface. Additionally, there are differences in the materials from which they are constructed. And so in the background here, what I have is some pictures of various shoreline types from Sydney Harbour. So we have, oh, they seem to be mislabeled at the top. So this is supposed to be the concrete wall over here. We've got a sandstone seawall here and a natural rocky shore here. And so even between seawalls that are constructed of our natural rock type, we see differences in things like colour between these structure types. This is quarried rock, so it has quite a different colour, and obviously lots of material differences between concrete and sandstone. And so for 20 years, we've known that the net effect of all of these differences between built structures and their closest natural analogues is a reduction in biodiversity. And so this is some of G. Chapman's early work from 2003, where she was looking at species accumulation curves on seawalls in Sydney Harbour, which is the dotted line, and also in rocky shores, the closest natural equivalent habitat, and finding that actually the number of species, once you account for sampling effort, is actually plateauing out lower for seawalls than rocky shores. And so I guess over the last 20 years, there's been increasing evidence amassing for these ecological differences between built structures and natural habitat equivalents. And in response to this, what we're seeing is increasing commitments around the world, both from the private sector and governments, in terms of addressing this issue. And so at the top here, we've got an example of Ørsted, which is one of the main offshore renewable energy companies. They have a lot of wind farms. And so they've committed to net positive biodiversity impact for new projects commissioned from 2030. At the bottom here, we have I guess what is going on now in England with a requirement for net biodiversity gain on all new construction, both in aquatic and terrestrial environments. So what are the options for ensuring no net loss of biodiversity or even biodiversity gain? And so I guess the first question is really, if we're talking about something like shoreline defence, is whether we actually need a built structure at all. So in some cases, it might be possible to provide shoreline protection benefits through repair or construction of natural habitats, such as mangroves, such as coral reefs, such as shellfish reefs, which can serve as natural breakwaters, which through their three-dimensional structure can dissipate wave energy, can hold sediments together. And the benefit of that is that we get all kinds of wonderful co-benefits of actually providing coastal protection with a natural structure, such as increased fisheries production, if it's a mangrove, perhaps carbon sequestration, and the likes. But in some instances, this is not possible, either because the conditions are not suitable for the repair or re-establishment of these natural habitats, or because there is social conflict and there might not be the space. And so if we're talking about some of our highly urbanised environments, there can be shipping lanes, there can be lots of conflicting activities. Also, in some environments, the wave action is so high that these nature-based solutions are insufficient to actually dissipate the wave, the effects of the wave action. And so in those instances, what we might need is a more greening the grey approach, and so actually ecologically improving the design of built structures. So first of all, the nature-based solutions, so the coastal protection using natural habitats. Why would we want to do this? And so this is just an example from oyster reef, which is a system that I work with a lot. And so if we're thinking about oyster reef, it can not only provide coastal protection, but a hectare of oyster reef in a year would filter 2.7 billion litres of seawater. It would remove 225 kilograms of nitrogen and phosphorus. It'd provide 375 kilograms of new fish to catch and eat. It would provide homes for over 100 species, and it can provide other benefits like if it's constructed of recycled shell, removing waste from landfill. And so through our National Environmental Sciences program here in Australia, I was involved in a project. We actually provided some guidance to the application of nature-based methods for coastal risk reduction. So in Australia, what we're finding is that there is very low uptake of these solutions so far. I think because there's very poor understanding of how they can be applied and what the benefits might be. And so this was led by Rebecca Morris, who some of you might know, who is based at the University of Melbourne. And so I don't expect you to be able to read this slide, but basically what we did is go through a whole heap of different habitat forming species and ecosystems that we find around the coastline of Australia. And we were looking at the different mechanisms by which it provides coastal protection. So whether it's via wave dissipation, sediment stabilisation, serving as a natural breakwater. So this is just the mechanisms at the top. And then we looked at factors that might influence suitability of these various ecosystem types. So whether it's limited by wave exposure, salinity, temperature, or other factors. What kinds of features you might need to include in the design of these habitats if you're wanting to use them for coastal protection. So is there a minimum density of these species that is required? Is there a certain shape of habitat that's required? Time to efficacy. So this is really important because I guess in some cases there is quite a long lead time before the habitat is sufficient to actually provide coastal protection benefits. So in some instances, 25 years. So if that's the case, I guess you're going to, be thinking about hybrid approaches where you're initially providing also a human-made structure as well to provide that wave dissipation until the nature-based approach is fully established. The scalability, the precedent, so how much it's been used before, the cost and the maintenance required. But what I really want to focus on today is, I guess, the more human-made end of this spectrum and eco-engineering, sometimes referred to as greening the grey. So those situations where it is unavoidable to have a built structure, or a built structure is indeed already in place. What can we do to actually enhance the ecological value of these, and how might we be able to design them to mitigate some of their ecological impact? And so what is possible depends a lot on the situation. So whether we're talking about constructing a new structure, be it for coastal defence or be it for some other purpose, or be it actually improving the ecological value of an existing structure. And so these pictures here show some of the examples from around Sydney of approaches people have taken to improving the ecological value of new structures. And so this is in an estuarine embayment where a revetment has been coupled with salt marsh planting as well. So this is a hybrid structure. So the boulders are actually providing nooks and crannies for species to live in. The salt marsh is adding to the ecological value. This is a seawall below that was refurbished, and when they were redoing the facade, what they did is leave out blocks from the facade and put lips on them so that there were pseudo rock pools built into the structure. And then down the bottom here, we have Barangaroo Headland Reserve, where they have recreated the foreshore using local quarried rock. And the pieces of rock are all different in shape and size, creating heterogeneity so that there is a greater variety of ecological niches for species to live. And the step design also provides opportunity for humans to actually interact with marine life as well. So this is in the heart of Sydney City. But where there's an existing seawall, the options are a little bit more limited. And so the types of approaches that can be used are additive, so adding habitat to an existing structure. And so at the top, we've got an example here of half flower pots that Mark Brown, Becky Morris and G. Chapman have strapped to seawalls in Sydney Harbour. And so these serve as pseudo rock pools. At low tide, they actually trap and retain water in the intertidal zone. You can add habitat enhancing panels. And so this is an example of a panel that was piloted at small scale during the World Harbour Project. And the other approach is a subtractive approach to actually drill textures into these structures. And so Louise Firth at the University of Plymouth has conducted some large scale trials with her industry partners looking at the application of this. But irrespective of what the approach is that is implemented, there are a few things that are really important when applying marine ecoengineering. So for the rest of the talk, really, I wanted to go through some of our work that have addressed these points. And so first of all, it's really important that the marine ecoengineering is targeted. So it should have clear goals in mind, and that might be to do with the enhancement of biodiversity, or alternatively, it may be based around ecosystem service provision or social benefits. And it's really important that there is monitoring and evaluation to actually assess how well the project is actually meeting these intended goals. Second of all, in a minute, I'll point out some research where we've looked at the efficacy of varying approaches at locations around the world. And we've certainly found that it is not one size fits all. Excuse me. So it's really important when applying these approaches that they are responsive to local environmental conditions and they are responsive to the ecological niches or the requirements of key target species. And that the approaches are evidence-based and they're supported by research. And then the final thing that I want to talk about today is scalability. So what we've found over the last 20 years is that there has been a heap of research done at small experimental scales investigating various approaches to greening marine-built structures. But until recently, there have been very few attempts to scale these up. So what I want to touch on is, I guess, how we might go about scaling these up, some of the challenges and considerations of doing that. So let's start with clear goals. So later today, I'll be talking about our Living Seawalls program, where we've been scaling up marine ecoengineering. And one of the first things we did with this program is run some stakeholder workshops, which involved both government, the private sector, local residents, recreational users of estuaries, and the likes. And so we did a whole heap of activities with them, one of which was getting them to brainstorm potential benefits and risks of marine ecoengineering and actually ranking these. And so the first thing with this workshop is that it was very encouraging that overall the people involved with these workshops ranked the benefits twice the value of risks in terms of a voting process that we went through. But what I wanted to particularly draw your attention to is the types of benefits and risks that they're identifying. So through a voting process, an anonymous voting process, they identified that their key perceived benefit of marine ecoengineering was increasing habitat for a marine environment and organisms. But other things that were really important to them were improvement of water quality, greater environmental stewardship, increasing educational value, providing a mechanism for driving further innovation, improving aesthetics, and improving the human quality of the blue space. But amongst these benefits, there were a couple of risks as well. And so one of the risks that they perceived with retrofits was potentially damaging the structural integrity of existing seawalls. And a big one, which we have been really careful to address right the way through our research, is greenwashing. So whether such activities might enable development to get through that shouldn't have got through, and how it might be used as lip service, basically, that there are environmental benefits. And so I guess these perceived benefits and risks were really important in forming subsequent installations as part of our program, and were really important in shaping our public education and outreach campaigns, being mindful not only to address the benefits, but also the perceived risks as well. So the next thing on the list was really the importance of marine eco-engineering being bespoke and evidence-based. And so what I wanted to do here is touch on some of the research we did a few years back as part of the World Harbour Project that some of you may have been involved with. So what we did as part of this program is run parallel experiments in 15 harbours across the globe, testing and comparing the efficacy of potential approaches to marine eco-engineering at pilot scales across these. And so what we did in each of these 15 harbours is assess, first of all, how habitat complexity influenced colonisation of local biota and biodiversity accumulation. So to address that, we had flat concrete panels that we attached to existing structures, ones with 2.5 centimetre deep vertical ridges and crevices, and ones with 5 centimetre deep crevices. And then we wanted to assess whether across sites, adding this kind of macro habitat feature was similarly important in influencing the growth and survival of key habitat forming species, in this case, oysters and mussels, that can be a key target species by stakeholders, first of all, because of their role in filtering and maintaining clean water, but also because they themselves can provide a complex three-dimensional geometry that can host a wide diversity of marine invertebrates and algal species. And so this slide here shows locations around the world. And what I'm showing here is the mean difference in the percentage of live bivalves, so this is oysters or mussels, that were attached to these panels at various locations. So the key thing to note here is a positive bar. So this is on complex versus flat surfaces. So positive bars here mean that there was greater survivorship on those crevice and ridged panels versus flat panels, and negative bar means that there was actually decreased survival. And so the first thing to note here is that, contrary to what we might expect, actually having crevices did not enhance the survival of oysters and mussels at all locations. So you can see some decreases at some sites. And so what we found is that whether there was a protective function of providing this microhabitat, perhaps not surprisingly, was related to the key stressor to the bivalves at that location. So if the key stressor was something like large fishes, the crevices were effective at reducing that predation and enhancing survival. And so that's the kind of thing that you can see at this site here and in Sydney. Similarly, if heat stress was the key cause of mortality, providing shaded, moist microclimates actually enhance survival, like at Chesapeake Bay and Keeling. But by contrast, if the key threat to these molluscs was actually small drilling whelks, actually what we saw is that this complexity not only the complexity actually enhanced the abundances of these whelks, leading to greater predation inside these microhabitats. So I guess the key message here is that whether complexity enhances survivorship of bivalves depends on source of mortality. And so really, when you're applying these types of approaches, you really need to understand what the key stressors are that are present at your site. Then this slide here shows the species richness, the mean number of species that we were detecting on panels of the different treatments. So we've got flat panels, we've got 2.5 centimetre deep crevices and 5 centimetre crevices. US is unseeded and S is seeded with the oysters or mussels. And so basically what we have is a gradient in complexity ranging from flat and featureless on the left to increasingly complex in terms of three-dimensional geometry on the right. So you can see that whereas at some sites there was clearly an increase in the number of species as complexity increased, which could be both a function of the increased surface area and also an increase of the protective microhabitats. At some sites, for example, if you look at this grey one here, there's little or no change, and in some cases even a decrease. So what this is showing is that the effects of complexity on species richness can actually vary from neutral to positive. And what we think is going on here is that it might be dependent on the size of the species pool. And so where there is a large species pool of available colonists, obviously complexity can have a positive protective effect, but in environments that are maybe very polluted or for whatever reason there are not a lot of available colonists floating around in the water, adding complexity isn't really going to help at all. So again, this is really getting back to the fact that you need to know what is limiting biodiversity at your location and whether actually complexity will help, whether protective microhabitats will help, or not. And then at a smaller scale, some of my PhD students have been doing some work on effects of substrate brightness. And so I guess if you look at a material such as concrete, it's very bright compared to, say, a dark basaltic rock. And so this may potentially have implications in terms of community development, both because some larvae respond to colour when they settle, and in particular, there can be a negative phototactic response of many sessile marine invertebrates. So that's settling into dark surfaces. And this, I guess, because they're associated with nooks and crannies and protected areas, but it also seems that just black surfaces alone can also elicit this response. Brightness can also influence camouflage and crypsis, and so organisms might be more visible on certain backgrounds than others. And then brightness can also influence thermal environments, and so light or bright colours tend to reflect more solar irradiance, whereas dark colours tend to absorb it. And so this is just showing here, down the bottom here with the colours, white, grey and black panels, and just showing the huge difference in temperature due to this different solar irradiance. And so what some of my students did is basically establish colour gradients of panels, brightness gradients of panels, based on the range of brightness values we see across natural and built structures in Sydney Harbour. And they deployed these panels at 3 locations in Sydney Harbour, which are actually pretty close together. And so you would expect maybe similar brightness effects at each. And so, sorry, that's supposed to be, say, are the effects of brightness spatially general? And so what I wanted to firstly show you is the effects of brightness on maximum temperature. And so the scale here, so the D1 is the lightest colour panels. So these are the white ones. D5 is the black panels. And then we've got various shades of grey in between. And so the first thing that you can note between the 3 sites, Carrabba Point, McMahon's Point and North Sydney, is that the temperature is actually really, really different between these, okay? So if you look at the max temperature at Carrabba Point, we're seeing temperatures that are maybe 15 or so degrees hotter at Carrabba Point than McMahon's Point. And so this may reflect both the aspects of the sites and the direction that they're facing relative to the sun, and also things like wave exposure that can influence evaporative cooling. And so what we're finding is that at our hottest sites, Carrabba Point and North Sydney, we're seeing cooler maximum temperatures on our white, bright panels than on our darker surfaces, particularly in the high intertidal, which is out of water for a longer period of time. So this is air temperature that is driving the max temperature. But also ranging down into the mid-intertidal as well. Whereas at a cooler site, we're actually seeing no effects of brightness on maximum temperature. And so then related to this slide here is showing species richness at each of the sites through time. And so what you notice, particularly in the mid-intertidal where colonisation was greater, is that at the hotter sites, Carrabba Point and North Sydney, where actually temperatures were cooler on the white panels, we're seeing a greater number of colonists on the white panels than the darker panels. But this pattern is not extending to our cooler site where there was no effective brightness on maximum temperature. So these results are suggesting that effects of brightness appear to be largely mediated by substrate warming and are greatest at sunny hot sites. And so this is showing you that these eco-engineering approaches not only differ in efficacy at, say, biogeographic scales, but they're also differing among sites that might be separated by only several hundred metres due to differences in factors potentially such as orientation and wave exposure. And so for the rest of the talk, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about our Living Seawalls program and how we've taken some of the results from the early eco-engineering pilot studies and applied them at larger spatial scales. So what we have done, I'll go back. Is basically build on these several decades of research by ourselves and others, demonstrating that there can, in some circumstances, be positive effects on biodiversity of enhancing the complexity of marine-built structures. And so what we've done is come up with modular habitat panels that are about 55 centimetres in diameter that can be installed on new or existing structures in mosaics, and the mosaics can be scaled up or down depending on the size and shape of the structure. And the panels come in a variety of designs that can be customised to location and environmental goals. And so the principle is really simple. So by enhancing the complexity of these panels, first of all, we increase the surface area for attachment of marine life, and also by providing protective microhabitat and a diversity of niches, we can also increase biodiversity. And so this is an example of our rock pool panel. And so what this features is these little cups that retain water at low tide when applied in the intertidal zone. And so what we've found is that these complex panels can support up to 3 times the number of species of flat panels of similar age that are placed adjacent. And so our Living Seawalls panels are inspired by nature and have 3D geometries that mimic the features of nature. So we've got actually 10 different panel designs to date, but this just shows 5 examples. And so, for example, the one on the left here mimics the natural honeycomb weathering of sandstone, which is the dominant rock type we have in Sydney. This is our rock pool panel that is retaining water in the intertidal zone. This one mimics the texture of kelp holdfasts. This one mimics crevices, and this is the one that we call sponge fingers. So it's got a more protruding type structure. And so, as I said before, the concept is really that we have these roughly hexagonal interlocking panels that can be arranged either in continuous mosaics or in patchy mosaics, depending on budget, aesthetics and environmental goals. And so our project started in late 2018 in northern Sydney. So this is Sydney Harbour that you can see here. So we established 2 sites in collaboration with a very supportive local government, and 1 site with the support of a corporate sponsor, Volvo Cars Australia. In 2021, we were very, very fortunate in being selected as a finalist for Prince William's Earthshot Prize, which drew lots of attention to our solution. And subsequently, we have expanded to, I think we're up to 14 sites around Sydney Harbour. We have installations in Townsville, Narooma and Adelaide in Australia, and also internationally in Wales, Gibraltar and Singapore, and new living seawalls installations soon to go in Plymouth in the UK and Boston. And so this just shows what some of our sites look like. We also have some underwater installations as well. So this is Barangaroo, around the corner from those stepped sandstone blocks that I showed you before. And at this site, we worked with a developer, Lendlease, to actually create an underwater garden on existing marine infrastructure. And so there were these old pilings going down. So we created struts to which we could create attached panels, and so these are not only found in the intertidal but also at depths below the water to I think about 10 meters, and also transplanting habitat forming species such as kelp onto them. So we're now close to 5 years into monitoring and evaluation of our initial sites. So just to give you a flavour for some of the things that we've found. So this was our initial site on the northern shore of Sydney Harbour, just under the harbour bridge. And so this is showing the number of species that panels accumulate over a 2-year period. So this is flat panels that we use as a control because they are similar age and similar material type but flat and featureless, and our complex panels. And so you can see here that we are seeing a lower number of species accumulating on our control panels than our complex panels. But among the complex panels, there are big differences among designs. And so our star performer in Sydney Harbour has been the rock pool panel that retains water at low tide. But I'll show you some results from elsewhere in the world a bit later where there are some really different results emerging. And so you might, for those, want to keep this in mind here. This is a swim through because that's one of the star performers elsewhere. So we've looked both at macro fauna and flora, so algae and invertebrates colonising the panels, but we've also looked at the microbiota establishing as well. And so this was sampling 8 weeks after panel installation. And so you can see that these patterns of difference between control and complex panels are being established really early on, with similar kind of pattern with rock pool and crevice emerging as the most diverse sites, even in the biofilms early on. And bacteria, we're finding that there is also a difference between control and complex panels, although less of an effect of designs here. But it's not just about number of species, it's also about compositional differences. And so don't worry too much about all the different groups of organism here, but the key thing to look at is different colours that are appearing in different places. So in this system at 12 months, really what we're seeing is communities that are dominated by oysters and barnacles. But when we add some of these microhabitat features, what we're seeing is algae colonising that wouldn't otherwise be there. So green algae, red algae. We're also seeing tube worms, brown algae, etc., particularly in the rock pool panel, but also the crevice and honeycomb panel that provide shaded moist microclimates. But by 24 months, what we're seeing is that competition is really starting to kick in. And on all panels, we're actually seeing that oysters are the habitat dominant. But what we're seeing is that actually increasing the 3-dimensional complexity is increasing the biomass and the cover of oysters. And so if your goal is actually increasing the biomass of filter feeding organisms, this might be beneficial. We're still seeing algae present and some functional groups present on the complex panels that wouldn't be found otherwise. But interestingly, biodiversity really seems to be peaking at the 12-month time period. And so this suggests that actually we really need long-term monitoring and evaluation of these eco-engineering approaches, because if we stop our monitoring too early, we may actually be overestimating benefits. So as well as looking at differences in colonisation at the panel scale, we've also looked at differences in colonisation of the site scale. And this is one of our other installations. This was the one with Volvo Cars Australia under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which you can see here. And so this is a mangrove root texture. And so at this site, what we found is 91 species colonising our living seawall over a 3-year period, compared to 43 or 31 on adjacent stretches of unmodified seawall. And this is really encouraging, considering that the panels were initially bare and devoid of life, whereas the adjacent stretches of seawall actually have years and years of marine growth. So we weren't actually clearing these before we did the comparison. So very encouraging results. And on our living seawall, we're actually seeing biodiversity that's matching that of reference rocky shores. And these benefits are not only limited to invertebrates and algae, but are also extending upwards to fish. And so this is some work one of my Masters of Research students did, looking at the site scale at fish observations as recorded by GoPro cameras at living seawall sites. So these are the eco-engineered sites. At reference rocky shores. So this is the biodiversity that we're aspiring to recreate. And then at control sites. So these are seawalls where there hasn't been eco-engineering, otherwise similar and unmodified. And so what we're finding after 24 months is that actually there are much larger numbers of sightings of fish to our living seawalls than controls, unmodified seawalls, and that this number of observations or fish sightings is actually matching those of rocky shores. So we're seeing that I guess the way that fish are using seawalls is actually becoming more similar to rocky shores where we're doing this eco-engineering. And some of the species that we saw that were particularly active around our living seawalls were first of all this bream here. And so these feed on oysters, and so presumably are responding to the increased cover of oysters on our living seawalls panels, and also some gobies and blennies, so small cryptic species that are actually taking advantage of the microhabitats in the panels. But as our number of installations and locations of installations is expanded globally, we've started to see some really interesting results. So this one here is from Wales. And what really stands out here is the massive growth of fucoid algae on some of our panels. And whereas we expected that this might be in the rock pool panels that were retaining water, that's not the case. So these are the rock pool panels here. The ones that are actually supporting all the fucoid growth are actually what we're calling the swim-through panels. So these are the ones with holes that go all the way through that were initially designed in Sydney Harbour to support fish. So what we think is actually going on here is actually suppression of limpet grazing. So one of the things that we've done at a number of our locations is, rather than actually attaching the panels flush with the wall, is actually offset them about 10 centimetres off the wall. So the panels are installed using stainless steel rods that are inserted into the seawall. But in some cases, it's difficult to install them flush because the surface that we're installing them onto is uneven. So it's not as simple as, say, tiling a bathroom. The other thing is, for example, the seawalls in Sydney Harbour that actually have lots of existing growth. What we don't want to be doing is having to clear that growth in order to place the panels. And so by actually sitting these 10 centimetres off the wall, we avoid having to do each of those things. And so what we think is going on here is that because the panels are sited off the wall, that's actually deterring limpet grazing and allowing this fucoid algae to grow. And interestingly, at this site here, the contractors made a mistake with one of these swim-through panels and attached it flush to the wall, and we didn't see this fucoid growth, which is why we think it might be due to decreased limpet activity. And then this slide here on the right is a site in Singapore at Keppel. And so these are some results here from, I think, the first year at a control site not receiving the panels. And then at this site, we've just got flat control panels, which are the white ones in the picture, and the rock pool panels. So we've got an internal control here. And so even from the photo, you can see that there's a stark difference in growth. And so what we found at this site, in conjunction with Peter Todd's team that has really been doing all the grunt work here, is that there is less colonisation of the flat control panels than the rock pool panels, and the rock pool panels actually through time are acquiring a greater species richness than the control wall. But an important part of our program has not only been the monitoring and evaluation, but also the outreach and education. And so this just shows some of our approaches in Sydney. And so this is the example of the public signage that we have been developing with local government. And so this was a commissioned sculpture, basically demonstrating what the panels look like when they're first placed out there, how they're colonised through time, and then how eventually we're seeing growth that is supporting species such as fish. With Volvo Cars Australia, we've co-created the Bondi Ocean Lovers Festival, and in the past we've had a experience where people can swim over living seawalls panels. And then we've been involved with various Science Week activities, such as create your own living seawall panel with high school students, and also panel discussions with local TV celebrities on scaling up marine eco-engineering. One of the benefits of our team is that we work very closely with a very talented designer, Alex Goad, who has his own business, Reef Design Lab, who has really been the lead in designing our panels with our ecological input. And so through Alex's connections, we've also been able to spread the word through exhibitions in galleries around the world. So this is Cube Design Museum in the Netherlands and MOD in Adelaide. So where are we going with this next? Well, I guess we started with seawalls because they were the low-hanging fruit. In Sydney Harbour, over 50% of our shoreline is armoured by seawall, and with no reconstruction on the horizon, there's really need to assess, well, how can we do better with what we have? But of course, seawalls are only one type of marine structure that we see. And so other common ones are things like pilings. And so what we have done is adapt our living seawalls approach so that it can be applied to pilings. And we presently have a project going on with DP World in Peru, where we've actually developed a moulding process where we can develop insets in a port redevelopment to include some of these textures. We've also developed revetment blocks that can be included in amongst the three-dimensional structure of boulders on these kinds of shorelines. And our first pilot site actually went in last week. So to summarise some of the key points from this talk, marine construction is a growing source of biodiversity loss in our coastal oceans. Nature-based solutions represent an alternative to traditional hard engineering and provide environmental and socio-economic benefits. But nature-based solutions are not always feasible, and so eco-engineering can improve in environmental services of built structures. But eco-engineering really needs to be evidence-based, and our research has shown that it is certainly not one size fits all. So to be applied appropriately, you really need to have a strong understanding of what is limiting biodiversity at your site, and what are the local environmental conditions, and what are the environmental requirements of the species that you are trying to encourage. And of course, the goals of the eco-engineering should be really clearly aligned with stakeholders and what they want. And it's really important that eco-engineering is evaluated against its goals so that it is not used as greenwashing. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our various funders. And you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and that is our website there. Thank you very much.